The chandeliers sparkled above, throwing golden light over the marble floor, where Manhattan's wealthiest gathered for the grand opening of the Whitmore Tower. Expensive champagne glasses clinked. Laughter echoed through the hall, and an orchestra played soft background music. Everything seemed perfect, until it happened. A sudden crash silenced the room. A crystal tray had slipped from nervous hands, shattering into 100 sharp pieces across the polished floor. All eyes turned toward the woman who had dropped it. She was wearing a simple black uniform, her hands trembling as she knelt to pick up the shards. Her name was Naomi Carter, a 36-year-old single mother working as a temporary cleaner at the event. For 3 weeks, she had quietly done her job, invisible to most. Tonight, however, she was about to become the center of a cruel spectacle. "Ladies and gentlemen," boomed Richard Whitmore, the billionaire host of the evening. His voice carried the weight of arrogance and too many glasses of whiskey. He raised his crystal glass and pointed straight at Naomi. "If she can dance a waltz, just one waltz, I'll marry her to my son." The crowd gasped. Some women covered their mouths in mock shock. Others giggled behind their hands. Men exchanged smirks, enjoying the humiliation. The orchestra faltered, strings squeaking as if even the musicians were unsure whether to continue. "Dad, stop this!" muttered Ethan Whitmore, his 29-year-old son, standing stiffly beside him. His face flushed with shame. But Richard ignored him, striding into the center of the ballroom like a judge about to sentence someone. "This woman can't even carry a tray without stumbling," he sneered. "How could she possibly keep time with music? Let's test her, shall we?" Naomi kept her head down, quietly gathering the shards. Her fingers shook, but her eyes, those who looked closely could see, were not filled with fear. They held something else, a calmness, a depth that unsettled even a few in the audience. The event manager tried to intervene, whispering nervously, "Mr. Whitmore, perhaps we should—" "Enough!" Richard cut him off with a dramatic sweep of his arm. "Play a waltz! Let's give our guests some real entertainment tonight!" A wave of laughter rolled across the room. Bets were already being whispered. "500 she trips before the first turn," one man joked. Another added, "1,000 says she runs away before the song is half done." Naomi finally rose to her feet. She dusted her apron with slow, deliberate movements, then lifted her chin. Her gaze locked on Richard Whitmore's, unwavering. The hall fell silent again, as if the room itself was holding its breath. "I accept," she said clearly, her voice slicing through the tension like a blade. The laughter stopped. Glasses froze mid-air. Even the orchestra members stared at her, bows hanging motionless. Richard blinked, stunned for the first time that night. "What did you say?" Naomi's lips curved into the faintest, most mysterious smile. "I said, I accept your challenge." And in that single moment, the power in the room shifted. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. The guests stood frozen, waiting for Richard Whitmore's roaring laughter, waiting for Naomi to collapse under the weight of her own words. But she didn't. She stood tall, her posture calm, her voice still echoing in the vast hall. Ethan Whitmore's eyes widened. He hadn't expected her to push back, not in front of hundreds of people, not against his father. He felt a strange mix of admiration and fear. His father was not a man who tolerated defiance. "You accept?" Richard repeated, as if the word was foreign to him. Then a sly grin spread across his face. Well, well, the cleaning lady has spirit. The crowd erupted in laughter again, though this time it carried a nervous edge. Some of the women whispered, hiding behind their jeweled vans. Men smirked, shaking their heads. To them this was nothing but entertainment, another cruel game played by the powerful at someone else's expense. "Dad, this is ridiculous," Ethan said firmly. "She doesn't owe you anything. She was just doing her job." Richard turned to him with a look that could freeze blood. "Quiet, Ethan. She agreed, and when someone accepts a Whitmore challenge, they honor it, or face the consequences." Naomi's eyes flicked briefly to Ethan. For just a second she caught something in his gaze, sympathy maybe, even shame. Then she looked back at Richard, her expression unreadable. "Fine," Richard continued, pacing like a predator circling its prey. "But let's make this more interesting." He raised his glass high. "If she dances better than my wife, she marries my son. If she fails," his eyes glittered with cruelty, "she leaves here on her knees, apologizing to every guest before I fire her on the spot." A ripple went through the crowd, gasps, then chuckles. The stakes had been raised to the point of humiliation. "Richard," a well-dressed guest muttered, "maybe this is going too far." "Too far," Richard barked to laugh. "This is entertainment, a demonstration of natural order. People like her should know their place." Naomi's chest tightened, but she did not flinch. She had heard those words before, spoken in different ways, in different rooms. All her life, people had tried to put her in a box, to tell her where she belonged. Tonight, she decided, would not be another one of those nights. She lifted her chin slightly and said, "Then let's do it properly. I will dance. But when I win, because I will win, you will keep your word, in front of everyone." The room went still again. The audacity in her tone sent murmurs rushing through the crowd. Some laughed, others looked intrigued. Richard smirked, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. He had built this challenge as a cruel joke, never expecting resistance. Yet here she was, a cleaner in a simple uniform, staring him down as if she were the one in control. "Very well," he said finally, his voice low and dangerous. "You want terms? You have them. Ladies and gentlemen, place your bets." At once, wallets opened, diamonds glittered, and money exchanged hands. The ballroom transformed into a theater of mockery, with Naomi at its center. But she didn't shrink. No, she stood straighter, calmer, as if she carried a secret none of them could understand. And deep inside her chest, something long buried stirred again. The ballroom buzzed with cruel excitement. The wealthy guests, draped in diamonds and tuxedos, treated the scene like a game. Bets flew across the room, $500 that Naomi wouldn't last a minute, $1,000 that she'd trip before the first turn. For them, this wasn't a challenge of honor. It was a spectacle, a circus. Naomi stood in the center of it all, her black uniform still marked with the dust of broken crystal. She looked out over the sea of faces, each one gleaming with arrogance, and for a moment it felt like she was no longer in the ballroom, but back in another place, another time. Her mind drifted 15 years back to a stage bathed in golden light, the hush of anticipation before the orchestra began. Back then, she was not Naomi Delane the cleaner. She was Naomi Delane, the principal dancer of the National Ballet. Critics had called her the rising star of a generation, her movements compared to legends who had defined entire eras of dance. She remembered the thunder of applause, the bouquets of roses tossed onto the stage, the sensation of flying when she leapt across the spotlight. And then darkness. The memory of headlights blinding her vision, metal twisting, glass shattering, the screech of tires, weeks of coma, doctors' voices heavy with pity. She'll be lucky if she walks again. Dance? Impossible. Naomi blinked, pushing the memory back. Not now, not here. Across the ballroom, Richard's wife, Evelyn Whitmore, finally stepped forward. She was in her 50s, tall, graceful, draped in a designer gown. With a venomous smile, she glanced at Naomi as though looking at dirt on her shoes. "You really think you can stand against me?" she scoffed. "Darling, I teach waltz to Manhattan's finest. This will be over in minutes." The crowd applauded Evelyn's confidence, some even cheering her name. Richard beamed with pride, clearly certain of his wife's victory. Naomi said nothing. She simply met Evelyn's eyes and gave the faintest nod. But inside, her heart was pounding, not from fear, but from awakening. She had not set foot on a dance floor in years, yet every fiber of her body remembered. It wasn't gone. It had only been buried. Near the edge of the room, a man in a dark security uniform watched intently. His name was Marcus, head of security at the tower. He had seen countless Whitmore events, countless humiliations, but something about Naomi held his gaze. A flicker of recognition nagged at him. Where had he seen her before? Richard clapped his hands, snapping Naomi from her thoughts. "Music!" he barked. "Let's begin this farce." The orchestra raised their instruments, waiting. Naomi inhaled deeply, her shoulders straightening, her eyes focused. She was not just a maid anymore, not tonight. She was about to remind the world who she really was. The orchestra struck the first notes, the sweet, steady rhythm of a waltz filling the grand hall. Evelyn Whitmore stepped proudly onto the dance floor, her gown flowing as she twirled with practiced grace. Her movements were polished, precise, the kind of dancing money could buy from the best instructors in Manhattan. The crowd applauded Evelyn's confidence, some even cheering her name. Richard beamed with pride, clearly certain of his wife's victory. Crowd, but inward, to the rhythm of her own breath. To most, she looked frozen with fear. But Marcus, the head of security watching silently, saw something else. Her subtle shifts, the way her toes pressed against the polished marble, the way her fingers stretched as if remembering muscle memory. These were not signs of hesitation. They were the warm-up movements of a professional preparing for performance. "Wait," Marcus whispered to himself, eyes narrowing. "I know those stretches. That posture. That's not a maid." Evelyn spun dramatically across the room, her smile sharp, her arms extended as if already celebrating her victory. She stopped in front of Naomi, tilting her head with mock pity. "Come along, dear," Evelyn taunted. "Surely you don't need instructions on how to take 3 simple steps?" Laughter erupted. The audience was eating it up, every cruel jab, every sneer. For them, this was theater, a comedy at someone else's expense. Naomi finally stepped forward. She moved slowly, each footstep deliberate, her shoulders back, her chin high. Her simple black shoes clicked softly against the marble, echoing louder than the music itself. For the first time all night, the room quieted. She positioned herself opposite Evelyn. The orchestra repeated the first bars, the violins swelling. Naomi closed her eyes, inhaled, and let her body remember. 15 years of silence, 15 years of suppression, 15 years of walking away from who she truly was, about to be broken with a single step. Ethan Whitmore, standing against the wall, leaned forward unconsciously. He couldn't explain it, but something in Naomi's stance made his pulse quicken. This wasn't the posture of a servant about to be humiliated. This was the posture of someone who had already decided the outcome. "Begin!"
Richard barked, slamming his glass down. Evelyn lifted her arms, confident, stepping into the spotlight with a flourish. Naomi remained still, calm, her eyes closed until the precise beat arrived. And then she moved. Not clumsy, not hesitant, but with a grace that made time itself seem to pause. Her first turn flowed seamlessly into the next, her body gliding across the marble floor as if gravity had forgotten her. The crowd gasped. The laughter died instantly. This was no maid fumbling through borrowed steps. This was the rebirth of a dancer. The first few steps sent a shockwave through the room. Her body flowed with the music, her every movement effortless, as if the waltz had been written for her alone. She didn't just dance, she commanded the floor, turning the humiliation into a stage. The guests who had been laughing seconds ago now leaned forward in stunned silence. A woman lowered her jeweled fan slowly, eyes wide. A man dropped his betting slip, forgetting he had wagered on her failure. Evelyn's confident smile faltered. She forced a pirouette, her gown swirling around her legs, but the elegance she thought she possessed looked stiff compared to Naomi's natural fluidity. Evelyn was rehearsed, technical. Naomi was alive, breathing art into every step. "Impossible," Evelyn muttered under her breath, as Naomi turned with a precision that professional dancers train decades to master. Richard's smug grin vanished. He straightened in his chair, his glass frozen halfway to his lips. "What is this?" he whispered, though the words were swallowed by the silence in the hall. At the far end of the room, Marcus clenched his jaw. His eyes followed Naomi's turns, her posture, the unmistakable lines of her arms. He had seen this before, 15 years ago, when he worked as a security guard at the National Theater. He remembered a young woman whose performances had made entire audiences rise to their feet in ovation. He remembered the critics calling her the star who redefined grace. And then it hit him. "My God," Marcus breathed, his heart racing. "It's her, Naomi Delane." He almost said it out loud, but caught himself, glancing around at the oblivious guests who still thought she was just a maid with unexpected talent. They had no idea they were watching a legend who had once ruled the stage until tragedy struck. The orchestra seemed to sense it too. Their bows moved with more passion, the strings swelling as Naomi's dance grew bolder, more breathtaking. She leapt, not just a ballroom step, but a grand jeté, her body suspended mid-air in a way that defied the ballroom's golden chandeliers and the smug expectations of every person watching. A ripple of gasps spread across the hall. Someone whispered, That's ballet." Another stammered, But she's supposed to be a maid." Ethan Whitmore's chest tightened as he filmed with his phone, unable to tear his eyes away. The way she moved wasn't just beautiful, it was defiant, as if every step were a declaration, "I am more than you think I am." Evelyn, now desperate, tried to exaggerate her movements, but the harder she pushed, the more forced and clumsy she appeared. Side by side.
Contrast was brutal. Naomi wasn't just competing. She was dismantling Evelyn's pride with every turn, every leap, every flawless extension of her arms. Marcus leaned toward her from the edge of the floor, his voice barely above a whisper. "I saw you dance years ago. I know who you are." Naomi's eyes flicked toward him for a second, a spark of recognition flashing in her gaze. But she didn't break her rhythm. She didn't need to answer. Her body was speaking louder than words ever could. By the time the music swelled into its middle section, the room had completely transformed. Gone was the laughter, the mockery, the easy arrogance. In its place was a silence filled with awe, and the first whispers of fear that Richard Whitmore's cruel game was about to backfire in the most spectacular way. And Naomi hadn't even finished. The violins soared, and Naomi soared with them. Each step carried a precision that left the ballroom breathless. She spun, dipped, and leapt with such elegance that even the chandeliers seemed to tremble in awe. What had begun as a cruel spectacle was transforming into something extraordinary, a performance none of them would ever forget. Gasps rippled across the hall. Guests leaned forward, their champagne forgotten, their bets meaningless. They weren't watching a maid stumble through borrowed steps anymore. They were witnessing a woman reclaiming a crown she had once worn. Who dances like that?" whispered a woman in pearls, her hand pressed to her chest. "I've seen this before," muttered an older man, his eyes narrowing. "Those movements, their signature." Naomi's arms stretched with perfect lines, her turns flawless, her timing impeccable. But beyond her technique, there was fire in her performance. Every step was alive, carrying the weight of years lost, battles fought, and dignity stolen. She wasn't just dancing to prove herself. She was dancing to remind them of what true greatness looked like. Evelyn tried desperately to keep up. She forced a spin, then another, but her movements were clumsy compared to Naomi's grace. Sweat formed at her temple as she realized the crowd wasn't watching her anymore. Every pair of eyes followed Naomi, captivated. Evelyn wasn't the star, she was the shadow. Richard Whitmore shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His smug expression had drained away, replaced with disbelief. "No, this can't be happening," he muttered, though his voice carried just enough for those nearest to hear. At the back of the hall, Marcus couldn't contain his whisper. "It is her, Naomi Delane, the ballerina everyone thought was gone forever." The name spread like wildfire among the guests. Naomi Delane? The dancer who vanished after the accident? No, she's dead, isn't she? They said she could never walk again. Naomi heard the murmurs, but she didn't falter. Instead, she pressed harder into the music, letting her body answer every doubt. She leapt again, higher this time, her skirt brushing the air as she landed in perfect rhythm with the orchestra's crescendo. The hall erupted, not in laughter, not in mockery, but in stunned applause. People were on their feet, clapping before the music had even ended. The orchestra, swept into the energy, played with more passion, as though accompanying a legend rather than entertaining the elite. Evelyn stumbled, nearly losing her balance. She glanced around desperately, but no one was watching her anymore. She had been erased from her own stage, and Naomi, once invisible, mocked, dismissed, stood in the center, her chest rising with steady breaths, her gaze unwavering. She had taken their humiliation and turned it into triumph. Richard slammed his glass onto the table, his face red with rage. "Enough!" he barked. But even his booming voice couldn't drown out the sound of applause echoing like thunder in the hall. For the first time in years, Naomi felt the weight lift from her shoulders. She wasn't just a maid. She wasn't just a survivor. She was Naomi Delane, reborn before the very people who had underestimated her. And deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. The music surged toward its final crescendo, and Naomi's body answered with a mastery that defied everything her audience thought they knew about her. She spun into a flawless pirouette, arms curved like wings, then launched into a grand jeté so fluid that it seemed she floated above the marble floor before landing as lightly as a whisper. The ballroom gasped in unison. This wasn't ballroom dancing anymore. It was ballet of the highest order, woven seamlessly into the waltz. It was a fusion only a true artist could command. Evelyn froze mid-step, unable to continue. Her face flushed crimson as she realized she had been outclassed beyond recovery. With shaky hands, she retreated toward the edge of the floor, her confidence shattered, her reputation slipping through her fingers.
At her anymore. They were staring at Naomi with wide eyes, as though they were seeing a ghost. Whispers rippled faster through the crowd. "It is her! Naomi Delane! She's alive! The ballerina who disappeared after the accident. I thought she could never dance again." The recognition spread like fire. By the time Naomi spun into her final pose, arms lifted, chest rising proudly as the music crashed to its end, the entire hall erupted in thunderous applause. People leapt to their feet, clapping, shouting, some even wiping tears from their eyes. "Bravo! Magnificent! Unbelievable!" For several long seconds, the ballroom was no longer a place of arrogance and mockery. It was an opera house, and Naomi was the star once more. Naomi bowed gracefully, her smile calm, her eyes shining not with pride, but with quiet vindication. She hadn't just danced a waltz. She had reclaimed her name, her dignity, and the respect she had once thought lost forever. At the edge of the room, Ethan Whitmore couldn't take his eyes off her. He felt a strange pull in his chest, a mixture of awe and shame for his father's cruelty. He raised his phone, still recording, determined to capture every second, not as evidence of humiliation, but of triumph. Richard Whitmore, however, was turning pale. His glass slipped from his hand, shattering like the tray Naomi had dropped earlier. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The crowd that had once laughed with him was now whispering against him. "You promised," someone muttered. "He said it himself, if she danced better than his wife." "And she did." Richard's jaw tightened. This is absurd," he bellowed, though his voice cracked with desperation. "This was a joke, nothing more." But the recording devices raised around the room told a different story. Dozens of phones had captured his exact words, his arrogance, his bet, and Naomi, standing tall in the center of the dance floor, wasn't about to let him wriggle free. With calm authority, she stepped forward, her voice carrying clearly. "Mr. Whitmore, you gave your word, before all these witnesses. Tonight everyone saw the truth." The room fell silent again. The applause quieted, replaced by tense anticipation. All eyes turned from Naomi to Richard, waiting to see if the arrogant millionaire would dare deny what the entire city would soon see for themselves. And in that silence, Richard realized the trap he had set for himself. Richard Whitmore's face turned crimson, beads of sweat forming at his temple. The mighty billionaire who had commanded rooms with nothing more than his voice now looked like a man cornered. Dozens of eyes pierced him, demanding an answer. Phones hovered in the air, recording every twitch of his lips, every crack in his mask. Naomi took a slow step forward. She wasn't smiling now. Her expression carried the calm weight of justice. "You said," she reminded him, her voice steady, "that if I danced better than your wife, you would keep your word. Those were not mine, Mr. Whitmore. They were yours, spoken loudly, for everyone to hear." A ripple of agreement murmured through the crowd. Guests nodded, some whispered indignantly, as if only now realizing the cruelty they had laughed at minutes earlier. Richard tried to laugh, but the sound came out hollow. "It was a joke, a party trick. Surely you all don't expect me to." "Yes, we do," interrupted a man in a tuxedo near the front. He wasn't laughing anymore. "You made a public promise." "And she delivered," added another guest, her jeweled bracelets clinking as she crossed her arms. "Better than your wife, I might add." Evelyn bristled, her pride wounded, but she said nothing. She couldn't. Naomi had already silenced her without uttering a word. Naomi's eyes stayed locked on Richard. She could have demanded anything: money, contracts, a place in his empire. But instead, she spoke with a strength that made the room grow even quieter. "When I danced better than your wife, and I did, I asked for more than your son's hand. I asked for the truth." Richard blinked. The truth?" "Yes," Naomi said. "I want you to stand before everyone here, in front of your friends, your investors, your family, and admit what you tried to deny.
that you judged me not for my skill, not for my worth, but for my uniform and the color of my skin. I want you to say it plainly and apologize." The air crackled with tension. A wealthy woman gasped. Another guest whispered, "She's forcing him to own it." Richard's jaw tightened. His pride roared against the demand, but the silence in the hall was louder. He glanced around, searching for allies, but the same guests who had laughed with him earlier now avoided his gaze. The tide had turned. Ethan stepped forward, his voice quiet but firm. "She's right, Dad. This has gone too far. You humiliated her in front of everyone, and she proved you wrong." "Shut up!" Richard snapped, his voice cracking with desperation. But his son didn't move. For the first time,
Stood against him. Naomi tilted her head slightly, her eyes calm but unyielding. "So what will it be, Mr. Whitmore? Will you keep your word, or will the world see you as not only cruel, but also a coward?" The ballroom waited, suspended in silence. Every guest knew the truth. This night had shifted power. The man who had mocked her was now the one under judgment, and Naomi, once invisible, once humiliated, stood as the judge. The silence pressed down like a weight. Richard Whitmore's face twisted between fury and fear, his pride waging war against the truth. For decades, he had been the man in control, the one who mocked, commanded, and humiliated without consequence. But tonight, the power had shifted. "I will not be lectured by a maid," he finally roared, his voice echoing through the ballroom. He pounded the table, rattling glasses, but the display only made him look smaller, more desperate. "Not a maid," Naomi corrected softly, her voice steady and unshakable. "A dancer, a woman, a human being worthy of respect." The crowd erupted in whispers. Some nodded, others clapped softly, as if testing the boundaries of rebellion against Richard's authority. For the first time, the people he thought were loyal were siding with someone else. Ethan stepped forward, his jaw clenched. "She's right, Dad. You crossed a line tonight, and you've crossed it too many times before. It's over." Richard spun toward him, rage boiling in his eyes. "Over? Do you have any idea what you're saying? If you stand with her, you stand against me, against this family, against everything I've built." "Then so be it," Ethan said firmly, his voice rising with conviction, "because what you've built is nothing without integrity, and tonight she showed more honor than you ever have." Gasps filled the room. Phones recorded every word, catching the exact moment a son chose dignity over dynasty. Richard's face turned pale. His lips trembled as he pointed a shaking finger at Ethan. "If you do this, you're out. Out of the company, out of the family, out of everything I own." Ethan didn't flinch. He simply turned to Naomi, extending his hand toward her. "Then I'll start over, but I'll do it standing beside someone who actually deserves respect." The hall erupted in applause. Guests rose from their chairs, clapping, cheering, some even chanting Naomi's name. The same people who had once laughed at her humiliation were now celebrating her victory. Richard staggered backward, his authority crumbling in front of the very people he had tried to impress. His wife Evelyn covered her face, humiliated beyond repair. For the first time in his life, Richard Whitmore was powerless. Naomi looked at Ethan's outstretched hand. For a moment, she hesitated, not out of doubt, but out of awe at how far this night had turned. Then, with calm dignity, she placed her hand in his. The applause thundered louder, shaking the walls, rattling the chandeliers. Richard shouted above the noise, his voice breaking, "This is blackmail! A setup! You're all fools!" But no one was listening anymore. The man who had once controlled the room had lost it forever. His voice was drowned out by the sound of celebration for Naomi, for Ethan, for truth finally breaking free. Naomi stood tall, her hand still in Ethan's, her chest rising and falling with steady breaths.
She wasn't trembling. She wasn't afraid. For the first time in 15 years, she wasn't surviving. She was living. Richard slumped in his chair, his empire cracking before his eyes. The man who had mocked a woman to elevate himself had instead humiliated his family, his name, his entire legacy. His phone buzzed relentlessly with messages from business partners and board members. They weren't congratulating him. They were demanding explanations. By morning, the headlines told the story for him. Billionaire humiliates maid, exposed as fallen ballerina legend Naomi Delano. From cleaner to queen, Naomi's dance shakes Manhattan's elite. The video spread like wildfire. Within hours, millions had watched Richard's arrogance unravel and Naomi's brilliance shine. Contracts worth millions began to vanish from his company overnight. Investors pulled out. Lawsuits loomed. His reputation, the very thing he valued above all else, was shattered beyond repair. Meanwhile, Naomi's phone
wouldn't stop ringing. The National Ballet wanted her back, not as a dancer, but as a choreographer. Lincoln Center offered her a solo showcase celebrating her return. Even Hollywood producers reached out, eager to tell her story on the big screen. But the offer that touched her most came from somewhere else. Children from the community school where she had taught quietly for years gathered to send her a video. "Miss Naomi," they said, voices filled with pride, "you showed the world what we already knew. You're a legend." Naomi wept, not from sadness, but from joy. For so long she had hidden from her past, ashamed of what she had lost. Now she realized she had never truly lost it. It had lived inside her, waiting for the moment she chose to rise again. 1 week later, at the opening of the new Community Arts Center, Naomi stood on stage, surrounded by children, dancers, and supporters. The applause that filled the hall wasn't for revenge or spectacle. It was for hope, for resilience, for dignity that could not be destroyed. As the event ended, Marcus, the head of security who had first recognized her, approached with a smile. "Ready for the next chapter?" he asked warmly. Naomi looked out at the children laughing, at Ethan standing proudly beside her, at the life she had rebuilt from ashes. She smiled, her heart light for the first time in years. "More than ready," she replied. Because Naomi's true victory was never about destroying Richard Whitmore. It was about proving that dignity, courage, and excellence could outshine cruelty and arrogance every single time. And in doing so, she didn't just win, she inspired.